It was a knock on my front door, a sharp, rude staccato that severed my once peaceful Saturday morning. Just seconds before, I'd been sinking into the living room sofa with a freshly brewed cup of dark roast, gazing out the window at my small fleet of vintage cars gleaming in the early sunlight. I've always taken pride in my automobiles. Each one is a story, a tribute to the years I've spent salvaging and restoring remnants of America's automotive history. From a '67 Mustang to a well-loved Ford pickup from the 1950s, they line my driveway and the extra lot next door, forming a personal museum of all the mistakes and triumphs I've had since buying this house 15 years ago. I took a slow sip, reluctant to give up my quiet when the rapping at the door became more persistent. With a sigh, I set my cup on the table and made my way across the wood floors. Standing there, brandishing a clipboard like a sword, was my neighbor Florence. She was wearing a blazer. Who wears a blazer on a Saturday morning? And she wore an expression that was about as warm as a half-frozen lake in January. "Carlton," she snapped. Florence is one of those people who greets everyone by their last name, even after you've corrected her 1,000 times. "Carlton, your presence has been requested at the next HOA meeting." And by requested, I mean required. "Good morning to you too, Florence," I said, forcing a polite smile. "What's this about?" She sniffed, adjusting her round, gold-rimmed glasses, then flipped through the pages on her clipboard. "Well, Mr. Richard," she finally corrected herself with obvious reluctance, "we've had a number of complaints about the excessive number of cars you park on your property. It violates subsection A4 of the Oak Grove Estates Homeowners Association's parking guidelines. You've also allegedly blocked sidewalk access, which could pose a hazard." At that, I almost laughed. My driveways, yes, I have two, are spacious, and the largest of my classic cars are carefully placed in the side lot that used to be a vegetable garden plot before I purchased it. None of them come close to blocking the sidewalk. But I knew from past experience that rational conversation with Florence was like trying to teach a fish to climb a tree. Pointless. "Florence, the sidewalk is clear, and nobody's in danger unless they trip over their own shoelaces," I said. "Are you sure there aren't more pressing issues around the neighborhood?" She stiffened. "The HOA has the right, and indeed the duty, to enforce the guidelines. We've received official complaints that your vehicles are an eyesore, and the board has unanimously decided to take action. You'll be formally presented with a notice of increased HOA fees next week to cover fines and administrative costs. As for now, please attend the meeting next Tuesday at 6 in the evening." And with that, Florence pivoted on her sensible heels and marched off my porch, leaving me in the midst of a swirl of indignation, confusion, and, if I'm honest, utter amusement. This wasn't the first time the Oak Grove Estates HOA had tried to flex its muscles. Usually, I complied with their requests if they seemed fair. Some of their rules were downright silly, like that time they tried to ban front yard bird feeders because they said it encouraged wildlife to congregate. But overall, I try to be a good neighbor. Until now, I played nice. But the threat of new fees, on top of these laughable accusations, left a bitter taste in my mouth. My father always used to say, "Pick your battles carefully, but when you do, don't show up unarmed." He was an old-school, self-made man who'd taught me never to turn a blind eye to people stepping on my toes, or my driveway, in this case. I stepped back inside, quietly shutting the door. The nostalgia of Dad's words echoed in my mind, pulling at a memory. He had left me more than just a keen sense of fairness when he passed away. He also left me something so big and so quietly powerful that most folks had no idea. The deed to the entire Oak Grove Estates development, once farmland, now built up with neat houses and trimmed lawns. He'd purchased the acreage decades ago as part of a bigger real estate vision, and as his only child, I inherited it. Yes, that's right. I own the whole neighborhood, from a manicured front entrance to the small lake at the community's southern boundary. Except, by design, nobody had connected those dots. The property owners here technically purchased their homes, but Dad had retained certain development rights, a complicated legal structure allowing him, and now me, to influence the overarching framework. The HOA existed on borrowed power, not realizing all their rulebooks were basically subject to final oversight by the land's rightful owner. I'd stayed in the shadows for years because I genuinely wanted the community to flourish on its own. Dad's dream was for Oak Grove Estates to be a pleasant place to retire or raise a family. Now, though, the HOA had awakened the sleeping giant. I dumped my cold coffee in the sink, replaced it with a fresh cup, and sat down at the kitchen table. A wave of giddy, mischievous anticipation washed over me. I never wanted to use my father's legacy as a weapon. But if the board was going to muscle me around, maybe it was time to remind them whose land they were standing on. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to put a stop to the arrogant nonsense that had overshadowed what once was a friendly, tight-knit community. I jotted down a few notes on a piece of scrap paper, outlining possible responses. I'd go to the meeting, definitely, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Years back, I let them believe I was just a vintage car fanatic with a modest retirement account and no desire to rock the boat. That was about to change. With a half-smile, I looked out at my glistening cars. My father's '67 Mustang was parked front and center, reflecting the sun. Maybe all these machines were a bit showy, but they were mine, and I'd spent years pouring sweat into them. If the HOA wanted to fight over too many cars, well, I was going to give them a story they'd never forget. Order, everyone. Order. The nasal voice at the podium belonged to the newly elected HOA president, a woman named Alice White. She was short and wore her hair in a severe bob that made her look simultaneously matronly and intimidating. She banged the little wooden gavel, as though calling to session some critical council that governed life and death. A small wave of chatter died down, and about 24 of my neighbors settled into their folding metal chairs, turning toward the front. HOA meetings were held in the Oak Grove Community Center, a modest building that was supposed to be a multi-purpose hall for celebrations, potlucks, and the like. Instead, it had turned into the monthly battlefield for petty squabbles, fence height violations, the correct color of front doors, and now, apparently, the scandal of too many cars. I found a seat in the second row. I was determined to appear calm, unruffled. That's how I always was in negotiations. But inside, I could feel the flicker of adrenaline. This was more than just a nuisance. I'd read the so-called formal notice they had emailed me yesterday. It threatened a substantial increase in HOA fees to offset the cost of monitoring and regulation. Essentially, they wanted to levy a penalty for each extra vehicle beyond the maximum of 2 per household. What if a family has 3 licensed drivers? I'd muttered to myself when I first read it. What about guests, or caretakers, or in-home nurses? Plenty of residents in this neighborhood were retirees, some with mobility issues, some who needed home health aides. This new regulation wasn't just a shot at me. It was a broad-brush rule that would punish many people who had legitimate reasons for multiple vehicles. My frustration grew by the day. The meeting got underway with old business. They talked about new light poles near the entrance, the upcoming summer barbecue, and some tree-trimming fiasco on Maple Drive. I sat through the first 40 minutes quietly until Alice cleared her throat and announced, "Now, we come to the matter of the excessive vehicles. That's new business item number 5. She turned to the crowd with a cool smile. As you know, the board has heard multiple complaints about unsightly driveways cluttered with too many cars. After thorough discussion, we have decided to issue fines and increased fees if any resident is consistently found to exceed 2 vehicles in public view. We believe this is fair and maintains the aesthetic standards of Oak Grove Estates." People exchanged looks. Aesthetic standards? I could almost hear the unspoken question in the room. Who decided that 3 or 4 cars were automatically ugly? A man across the aisle raised his hand. "My granddaughter just moved in with us," he said politely. "She has a small sedan. It's not an old junker or anything. That means we have 3 cars. Are we going to be fined?" Alice pursed her lips. "Well, it depends on the specifics. But the short answer is yes, if you regularly park that vehicle in your driveway. The board can make exceptions on a case-by-case basis, but we encourage you to find off-site parking or limit your usage." A low murmur followed. I saw heads shake in disapproval. This was classic HOA overreach. My mind wandered to the legal documents I possessed, the master deed, the land trust contract, all the quiet power my father had stowed away like a hidden ace. I took a breath, reminding myself to stay composed. Then came my moment. Alice's gaze shifted pointedly toward me. Mr. Richard, we understand you are in particular violation. You have, by our count, 7 classic cars in your possession, parked in various driveways and side lots. Did you have any explanation or mitigating reason for that? I stood up slowly. I've restored those cars myself over many years, I began. I followed the rules as I understood them when I bought my house. No blocking sidewalks, no permanent street parking, no commercial usage. All I do is keep them on my private property. They're licensed, insured, and safely maintained. I fail to see how that harms the neighborhood. Her eyes narrowed. Your property is quite large, which is part of the issue. It sets a precedent for others that we do not wish to encourage. We simply want a uniform standard. I suppressed a wry chuckle. The reason my property was larger than average was, of course, because I'd quietly purchased a few adjacent lots that were effectively under my own broader ownership anyway. But I just shrugged. Understood. And my stance is that you're overstepping. You could be running people out of the community for innocuous reasons. I know folks who have collector cars, or a few visitors each month, or even live-in caretakers. This new rule doesn't serve them. It punishes them. A round of quiet applause broke out from a few people around me. Alice's face reddened. Well, Mr. Richard, you're entitled to that opinion. The board decision is final. Next week, we will implement the new fee structure. If you refuse to comply, the HOA will pursue further action, including liens. She paused. Are you prepared to accept those consequences? Her tone dripped with the smugness of someone who believed they held all the power. I glanced around. Some neighbors, particularly the older ones, looked alarmed. They'd seen HOAs go after residents before, resulting in messy legal fights. The last thing I wanted was to pit neighbor against neighbor. But sometimes a little shock and awe is exactly what's needed to restore balance. I clear my throat. I intend to respond in a manner consistent with my rights. Let's just say I have documents that may supersede your rules, though I've never invoked them before. Alice scowled. This is a legally established homeowners association, Mr. Richard. I'm not sure what sort of documents you believe you have, but all residents must abide by the guidelines or face the penalties. That's how HOAs work. I nodded. Understood. Then, calmly, I retook my seat, ignoring the curious stares around me. I wasn't ready to show my hand. Not yet. The remainder of the meeting continued with other agenda items, but I could tell the tension in the room was thick enough to slice with a butter knife. As I scanned the faces around me, I saw frustration, confusion, and a hint of fear. The older couple in the back clutched one another's hands. A single mother near the aisle nibbled at her thumbnail. These rules had real impact on real lives. When a meeting finally adjourned, small groups of neighbors clustered together, whispering. I quietly slipped out a side door, only to be ambushed by Florence. She glared at me, color high in her cheeks. Don't think you can scare Alice or me with your illusions of having special rights. The rules are the rules, and we're done letting you act like you own the place. I gave her a small, polite smile. Noted, I said, voice deliberately mild. Then I walked away, heading to my cherry-red Thunderbird parked near the entrance. Some might call it provocative to drive the exact kind of excess car they were railing against, but I just saw it as the perfect exclamation point to end the evening. I started the engine, listening to that sweet purr, and drove out of the parking lot under the watchful eyes of the HOA board members, a swirl of thoughts forming in my mind. The time had come to set the record straight. This wasn't about me refusing to follow the rules. It was about standing up for fairness and protecting neighbors who might not have the resources or the legal knowledge to fight back. They wanted a showdown? Fine, I could do that. My father's dream was for Oak Grove Estates to be a thriving place, not strangled by petty bureaucrats. That was a dream I intended to honor, no matter what it took. I spent the next few days preparing, poring over the legal documents my father had stashed in a weathered leather briefcase. Many of them were older than I was. Yellowed edges, crisp official seals, archaic language speaking of easements, restrictive covenants, and development rights. Dad had painstakingly hammered out these deals decades ago. He was a shrewd man, friendly to a fault, but always 3 steps ahead in any negotiation. As I leafed through page after page, I rediscovered some of the cunning clauses that essentially allowed the original landowner, now me, to approve any major changes within the subdivision's governance. If the HOA wanted to adopt or significantly amend rules that could materially affect property owners, they were legally obligated to get my blessing. In other words, the board's new excess car rule was a direct violation unless I signed off. And I sure as heck wasn't signing off. I recalled, with a pang of sadness, the times Dad and I would wander through this land when it was still farmland. We'd watch the sun drop behind the tree line, talking about the future. He dreamed of building a neighborhood that would become a haven for families and retirees alike, a place unburdened by the congestion of city life. For a while, that dream flourished. People here used to gather for big picnics on the 4th of July. Everyone seemed to genuinely like each other. But as the HOA turned into a power-hungry entity with each passing year, that warm sense of community started fading. Late Monday afternoon, I took a ride on my old Harley around the neighborhood. A few folks waved. Some seemed timid, others friendly, but overall I sensed tension. These new parking rules had become the talk of Oak Grove Estates. A neighbor named Marjorie was watering her plants. She waved me over and whispered that she worried her out-of-state kids wouldn't be able to visit without risking a fine. Another neighbor, an older widower named Jim, confided that he'd been threatened with a citation because his driveway needed repaving. It was a never-ending barrage of petty nitpicks that made no sense to me. When Tuesday evening arrived, I decided to pay a visit to the HOA board in a more personal setting. They were holding a smaller executive session at the same community center. Only a handful of members and a president, Alice, would be there. The official story was that they needed to finalize the details of the new fee structure. Unofficially, I suspected they wanted to discuss how to best bring me to heel. I parked 2 blocks away to avoid making a scene, didn't want them complaining about my '67 Mustang hogging up spots, and walked to the building. Through the glass doors, I could see Alice, Florence, and a couple of others sitting around a plastic fold-out table. A coffee pot steamed in the corner. None of them looked happy. Stepping inside, I cleared my throat politely. "Evening, folks." They turned as one. Florence's eyebrows shot up. Alice set down her pen, surprise flickering across her face before she arranged her features into an icy mask. "You're not on the board, Mr. Richard," she said, pointing to a small sign taped to the door that read Executive Session, Board Members Only. "You have no right to be here." "No." I pulled out a folded letter from my pocket. "Allow me to read something to you, then." Their eyes narrowed suspiciously. I began. "In the event that the Oak Grove Estates Homeowners Association shall adopt or seek to enforce any new covenant or rule that materially affects the use of a property within the development, the consent of the original landowner or their direct heirs is required. Failure to obtain such consent shall invalidate said rule." I looked up to see 4 pairs of widened eyes. Florence actually had her mouth open like a fish gasping for air. Alice tried to speak, but only let out an awkward cough. "These are the original documents from when Oak Grove Estates was carved out of farmland," I explained, my voice echoing in the near-empty room. "My father was the owner. Upon his passing, that ownership and all associated rights transferred to me. I'm sure you'll find the official notary stamps quite legitimate." Alice's expression darkened. "So, you claim the HOA can't make rules without your permission? That's preposterous. This is a standard HOA recognized by the county." I offered a tight smile. "You might call the county to verify. You'll find that the property developer retains these rights indefinitely unless they choose to sell or waive them, which neither I nor my father ever did." They looked at each other uneasily. A man named Harold, who usually oversaw neighborhood landscaping decisions, ventured a question. "What do you want, then?" "I want you to drop the new parking rule," I said plainly, "and any plan to impose extra fees without a fair process. Further, I want the HOA to take a hard look at all its policies and stop harassing homeowners over minor or purely aesthetic issues." If there's a real issue, like, say, someone storing garbage in their front yard, fine, address it. But these arbitrary fines and threats have to stop. They're not only unfair, they're legally questionable. Florence shook her head, regaining her composure. But you can't expect us to let the neighborhood become a free-for-all. Without strict guidelines, people will do whatever they want. They'll paint their houses neon pink or keep boat trailers in the driveway. I shrugged. I understand the need for some level of order. But that doesn't mean every third car or every weed in the sidewalk is a capital offense. Look around. Neighbors are scared. They resent you. That's not a thriving community. Alice squared her shoulders. You don't have to run the HOA, Mr. Richard. We were elected. If you think we've overstepped, then fine. We'll see you in court. I raised an eyebrow. Perhaps. But before you take it that far, know this. A judge will see these documents the minute we file. The association's entire foundation might be challenged because you enacted rules without the rightful landowner sign-off. That could shut down the HOA permanently. A tense silence followed. Then Alice, Florence, and Harold exchanged grim glances. They knew I had them cornered. At length, Alice's facade cracked. So what do you propose? First, I said, you rescind the new parking restrictions immediately and announce to the community that the matter is closed. Second, you agree to revisit the HOA charter with me and a neutral mediator so we can set fair guidelines that actually reflect the community's wishes. And third, I added, you hold a special public meeting where every homeowner can speak openly, without fear of retribution. We'll put the future of the HOA to a vote, as my father originally intended. I could almost see their internal debates raging. Fear, anger, grudging acceptance. They didn't want to lose face, but they had no legal standing to push back. Finally, Alice pressed her lips together in a thin line. We'll consider these conditions, she said stiffly. But you should know this. Some of us actually believe these rules keep property values high. I spread my hands. Keeping property values high is good. Suffocating your neighbors with pointless regulations is not. I'm not looking to create anarchy. I just want to ensure no one else gets threatened over something as harmless as having a granddaughter or a nurse park in their driveway. With that, I turned on my heel and left them to their closed-door plotting. Outside, the sky was a rich purple, stars just beginning to peek through. I took a deep breath. This was only the first real confrontation. By brandishing the original development documents, I'd forced them to recognize my authority. But I knew that after the shock wore off, there might be plenty of resentment coming my way. As I walked back to my parked car, I felt a surge of resolve. Dad never intended for me to be some tyrannical overlord. His dream was a friendly neighborhood that policed itself through goodwill and neighborliness, not intimidation. If that meant stepping in now, so be it. The engine of my Mustang roared to life, and I steered it gently into the street. Lights in the houses around me winked in the twilight, warm spots of domestic life. In my mind, I could almost see Dad strolling the farmland here, telling me we could build something beautiful. I smiled a little, hoping that, wherever he was, he approved of the path I was taking. If all went well, Oak Grove Estates might just reclaim the sense of harmony it used to have. The special meeting took place the following week in the largest space the community center had to offer, a multi-purpose room lined with foldable chairs. Word had spread fast about the confrontation between me and the HOA board. Neighbors showed up in droves, some out of curiosity, others out of frustration, and a few out of outright hope the new era might be dawning. I arrived early, setting up a folding table near the front with copies of the key documents. A local mediator I hired, a soft-spoken older gentleman named Dwight, arranged his notes and took a seat next to me. He'd successfully worked on local land disputes for years and came highly recommended. My aim was to keep tonight civil, if possible. By 6 o'clock, the room was full. People were standing in the back or leaning against the walls. Florence sat beside Alice, both wearing expressions of guarded hostility. Harold and the other board members tried to appear neutral, though I could sense their discomfort. Dwight stood up, tapping a small microphone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending. Tonight, we'll address the governance of the Oak Grove Estates Homeowners Association, particularly in light of newly surfaced development documents. Our goal is to find a path forward that satisfies the legal requirements and the community's best interests. Before we begin, I'd like Mr. Richard to say a few words. I adjusted my tie, a rarely worn item, but I dressed for the occasion. Neighbors, I began, my father was the original owner of this land. Some of you might know that. Some of you might not. When he passed, I inherited certain rights as the developer and landowner. For years, I stayed in the background, allowing the HOA to operate independently in the hope that it would serve the community's needs. A hush fell over the crowd. Eyes locked on me, some with surprise, others with excitement. Recently, the HOA board proposed new parking restrictions and fees that I believe overreach. I continued. Not only do they harm folks who have legitimate reasons for multiple vehicles, but they also violate clauses in the original covenants requiring my consent for major rule changes. I'm not here to dissolve the HOA outright, but to fix it. To that end, I'd like to propose a series of reforms, which I hope will be voted on tonight. Dwight motioned for Alice and Florence to speak. Alice cleared her throat, standing at the microphone with the same severe posture I'd seen at the first meeting. We understand the original documents grant Mr. Richard certain veto powers. However, we stand by the idea that a structured HOA is beneficial to property values and community appearance. We're willing to discuss modifications, but we are not willing to cede total control. A few voices in the crowd murmured. One older resident, Ms. Green, raised her hand. Why is the board so keen on restricting vehicles, anyway? In my day, families had multiple cars for different needs, and nobody minded. Alice paused. It's the principle of it, preventing clutter, preserving a uniform look. That's what keeps the development appealing. Dwight asked if anyone else wanted to comment. A flurry of hands shot up. One by one, neighbors took the mic, sharing frustrations. Tickets for leaving a Christmas wreath up too long. Fines for letting a dog leash extend onto communal grass. Threats over a wheelchair access ramp that supposedly didn't meet the style guidelines. Hearing these stories, some members of the audience stared at the board in dismay. An elderly gentleman in a wheelchair actually rolled up to the front. We moved here because we thought it was a welcoming community, he said. But last year, the HOA slapped us with a warning because our grandson's tricycle was on the front porch. They said it violated clutter rules. Is that what we've come to? That sentiment seemed to echo around the room. The tide was turning, and I could see Alice realizing this was more than just me with an axe to grind. It was the entire neighborhood fed up with overregulation. Dwight nodded respectfully. It seems we have a strong demand for change. Mr. Richard, you mentioned some proposed solutions? I took a breath. Yes. First, we strike down the new parking restriction rule, effective immediately. Second, we form a new oversight committee of volunteers, residents who are willing to represent the community's interests. Instead of the board imposing rules top-down, any potential regulation would first go to this oversight committee, which would gather feedback from residents. Third, no major amendment can pass without a direct vote of all residents, plus my sign-off if it materially affects property use. Finally, we adopt a principle of reasonableness, meaning that if a proposed rule doesn't address a genuine health, safety, or significant property value concern, we don't adopt it. Period. The applause was immediate, a ripple starting from the back of the room and building into a roar. Alice's face was flushed, but she looked resigned. Florence practically glowered, but even she realized the community's sentiment had become clear. Residents wanted the HOA to revert to a supportive function, not an authoritarian one. Dwight quieted the applause. Is the board willing to consider these reforms? Alice exchanged a quick look with Florence and Harold. Harold nodded hesitantly. Florence's lips compressed into a thin line, but she shrugged. Alice faced the microphone again, sounding more subdued than before. We will consider them, if they truly reflect the neighborhood's wishes and meet the legal requirements. The board will comply. Dwight smiled. In that case, let's put it to a vote. Show of hands. Who supports Mr. Richard's proposals? A sea of hands shot up, arms reaching high in the air. Some people even stood up to better display their support. Florence wilted. Alice, to her credit, tried to maintain dignity. But the conclusion was obvious. Maybe a dozen hands stayed down, but at least 100 were in favor. "I think that settles it," Dwight said, turning to me with a small grin. "We'll formalize the documents." In the sudden hum of excited chatter, I caught Alice's eye. She gave me a curt nod, an acknowledgement that the old order had just changed. Though part of me sympathized with her wanting a neat, tidy environment, she'd gone too far. If she was willing to adapt, I'd welcome her involvement. If not, the community would move on. After the meeting adjourned, neighbors clustered around, some shaking my hand and expressing relief. A handful of them asked if I planned to stick around Oak Grove Estates. "It's your place, after all," one joked. "You own everything in sight." I laughed. "I'm not a dictator, if that's your concern. I just want to live in peace, maybe restore a few more old cars now and then." Leaving the community center, I felt a profound sense of closure and new beginnings. The air was crisp under the streetlights, and a few early stars glowed overhead. The tension of the last few weeks ebbed from my shoulders. For years, I'd kept Dad's legacy hidden, not wanting the attention or the responsibility. But in stepping forward, I realized I could protect the community from the very thing Dad had warned me about: mindless bureaucracy strangling real neighborly values. The next morning, I strolled outside to admire my collection of vintage cars, no longer worried about a frivolous fee for having too many. Passing my '67 Mustang, I ran my fingertips along its sleek frame, recalling the day Dad and I had first found her in a dilapidated barn. We spent a whole summer bringing her back to life, sharing stories, laughing, cursing at rusty bolts, eventually celebrating when the engine finally roared to life. A memory of Dad's voice echoed in my head. "You gotta protect what's yours, son, but do it with decency, because what's truly yours is also what you share with the world." I smiled softly. The morning sun spread across the neighborhood, lighting rows of houses that now felt a bit more like a real community and a bit less like a restrictive compound. Across the street, I noticed Jim giving me a thumbs up from his porch. Down the block, Marjorie was chatting happily with another neighbor who'd once been ticketed for painting her front door a non-approved shade of pale green. Hopefully, those days were behind us. Yes, I own the land, but the people make this place what it is. That's what Dad always believed, and that's the principle I intended to uphold. Maybe the HOA would still exist, but now it would be a tool for shared benefit, not a weapon for petty power. In the weeks to come, we formed the new Oversight Committee, hammered out friendlier guidelines, and replaced punitive measures with cooperative ones. Instead of fines, we offered help. Instead of sneaking around with cameras, we rang doorbells and asked neighbors what they needed. Slowly, that spirit of unity Dad always envisioned crept back in, like spring flowers re-emerging after a harsh winter. And so, if you see me standing in my driveway, tinkering with the engine of a restored Thunderbird or buffing the hood of a sleek old Chevy, remember this. I'm not just some car guy who forgot to read the HOA fine print. I'm the quiet caretaker of a dream that started when this land was just open fields. A dream of neighbors looking out for each other, free from heavy-handed rules that stifle real life. I own the neighborhood, yes, but more importantly, I cherish it. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the only way to live in a place called home. The end.